Hello there, sleepy hearts. Tonight, beneath the silver mist of the Pacific Northwest and the quiet hush of ancient trees, we drift into the world of the Olympic Coven. A family bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by a philosophy that dares to believe immortality can be lived with grace. Breaking Dawn ended, but their story did not. The Cullens have centuries ahead of them. Quiet decades of adaptation, of love deepening like roots in old earth, of peace hard-won and carefully kept. I'm pouring my heart into these videos, and sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. And then one of you leaves the sweetest comment, and it reminds me why I'm doing this. I haven't hit my goal of 1,000 subs yet, but I'm not giving up. If you want to support a small creator who's trying to make something beautiful, please consider subscribing. Thank you. So, settle in now. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the forest take you. The Cullen house was quiet in a way it had not been for months. Not the brittle, held breath quiet of the weeks before the confrontation, when every room had been thick with preparation and suppressed fear, when Bella had been learning to fight and Alice had been gone, and the weight of what was coming had pressed down on all of them like weather. This was a different quiet entirely. This was the quiet of a house that had exhaled. The quiet of people who had stood at the edge of something terrible and stepped back from it, intact, together, alive in all the ways that mattered to immortals. The river still ran behind the house. The forest still stood, dense and green, and indifferent to everything that had happened in that clearing. The mist came in each morning the way it always had, settling into the low places between the trees, softening the edges of the world into something impressionistic and gentle. Forks, Washington did not know what had nearly happened within his borders. The town went about its quiet business, the grocery runs and school mornings and evening news, the ordinary machinery of human life. And the Cullens went about theirs, and the ordinariness of that felt in those first weeks, like a gift so precious none of them quite dared to name it. Carlyle felt the relief more deeply than he allowed himself to show. He was not a man who performed composure. It was simply his nature, the centuries of practice and deliberate self-cultivation that had made patience and steadiness as natural to him as breathing had once been. But those who knew him well, who had lived beside him long enough to read the subtle language of his stillness, could see the difference in those weeks, the slight loosening of his shoulders, the way he spent long evenings simply sitting beside Esme in the main room, her hand resting in his, no particular agenda, no task pressing for completion. Carlyle, who was always purposeful, always oriented towards something beyond the present moment, allowed himself in those weeks to simply exist inside his own home, to listen to the river, to watch the light change in the trees. It was the closest thing to rest that his particular nature had ever permitted him. and he accepted it with the same quiet gratitude with which he accepted most good things, without fuss, without fanfare, but with his whole heart. His mind, though, was never entirely still. Carlyle had understood from the precise moment the Volturi turned and walked away from that clearing. From the moment Aro's dark eyes swept one final time over the assembled witnesses, cataloguing, measuring, filing away, that what had occurred was a reprieve rather than a resolution. Aro did not forget. Aro did not release desires he had not yet satisfied. He simply revised his timeline for their satisfaction, sometimes across decades, sometimes across centuries, with the inhuman patience of someone for whom waiting had ceased to carry any real cost. The confrontation had revealed something Aro had not previously known with certainty, that the Olympic Coven could assemble an extraordinary coalition of witnesses and gifted allies on very little notice across multiple continents, with bonds of loyalty genuine enough to hold even under the specific psychological pressure the Volturi were designed to apply. That knowledge would now factor permanently into every calculation Aro made regarding Carlyle's family. It would make him slower, more careful. It would not make him abandon what he wanted. And so, even in the weeks of quiet recovery, Carlyle was writing letters. He wrote to Tanya, Kate, and Elizar in Denali. Not the urgent, desperate appeal that had preceded the confrontation, but something warmer and more sustained. Gratitude first, genuinely and specifically expressed, and then, carefully, the suggestion of continued correspondence, of a relationship that might grow beyond the alliance of necessity it had originally been into something more deliberately chosen. He wrote to Siobhan and Liam and Maggie in Ireland, to Zafrina and Senna deep in the Amazon basin, to others who had come and stood with them in that clearing, and then returned to their own distant lives. He planted seeds of connection with the meticulous patience of someone who understood that the most important things grow slowly. The letters would not bear fruit immediately. Some might not bear fruit for decades. Carlyle had always been comfortable with that particular kind of hope, the kind that does not require a visible return to justify the investment. Esme moved through the house in those first weeks like someone relearning the particular pleasure of familiar things after a long deprivation. She had come closer to losing everything. The family she had built across a century, the life she had chosen and tended and loved into being, than she ever permitted herself to contemplate directly. The aftermath of that nearness was not grief, precisely. Grief required loss, and she had lost nothing, not ultimately. What she felt was something more like tenderness, a sharpened awareness of the value of ordinary moments. She rearranged small things around the house with careful attention, as though seeing them newly. She spent an afternoon in the garden that had been neglected across the months of preparation, her hands in the cold earth, her mind simply present with the work. And then, with the focused and loving attention she always brought to the projects that mattered most to her, she turned her considerable creative energy toward the cottage. Edward and Bella's cottage sat a comfortable distance from the main house, connected by a winding path through old-growth trees. Esme had built it with extraordinary care, had furnished and decorated it to reflect her understanding of the two people who would live there, and it was already beautiful, genuinely, thoughtfully beautiful, in the way that only spaces made from love rather than obligation ever manage to be. But Esme looked at it now with new eyes. She understood, in the aftermath of the confrontation, that this home was permanent in a way no Cullen home had been before. There was a child here, rooted to this place. There was a wolf, imprinted and therefore irrevocably bound, and that binding extended outward to encompass the whole web of treaty and relationship that the Cullens maintained with the Quileute on the coastline to the west. The family was not going to move on from Forks the way it had moved on from every previous home across the decades. The quiet disappearing act, the new names in a new town, the careful erasure of evidence that they had ever existed in a particular place. Something had changed. They were, in some fundamental sense, staying. And so Esme added to the cottage garden, extended its boundaries into the surrounding trees, added raised beds where Bella could grow things if the impulse took her. She converted a small back room into a dedicated reading space. Walls of shelves, good light, a deep chair, a room that said clearly and specifically, "This is yours. This is for you alone. This is a space that belongs to your inner life." It was how Esme expressed love. It always had been. She made places where the people she loved could be most completely themselves, and then she stepped back and let them live in those places, and watched, and was quietly happy. Alice was quieter than usual in those weeks, which registered in the household the way a change in weather registers, not dramatically, but felt in the body. Alice's natural state was movement and anticipation, and the particular bright confidence of someone accustomed to seeing around corners, to arriving at situations already knowing how they would unfold. The crisis preceding the confrontation had exposed the limits of her gift in ways that unsettled her at a level she did not fully articulate even to Jasper. She could not see the wolves. She could not see Renesmee, whose hybrid nature existed outside every parameter her vision had ever worked within. In the weeks when the family had needed her most acutely, she had been, in the most important respects, effectively blind. She had found her way through. She had located Pia and Nawel, had provided the evidence that ultimately made the confrontation survivable. But the experience of her own limitation, the specific terror of reaching for her gift and finding it simply absent, sat with her in the quiet aftermath like a stone she couldn't quite put down. Jasper stayed close to her, as he always did when she was processing something difficult. They had been together since 1950, and across all those decades, they had developed a language between them that required very few words. He was, by the nature of his gift, constantly aware of her emotional state, of everyone's emotional state, the overlapping textures of feeling that ran through the household like weather systems, perpetually present beneath the surface of ordinary life. In those first weeks, what he felt from the house was something he could only have described as a chord. All the individual emotional notes of his family, each distinct, playing simultaneously. Relief was the dominant note, enormous and resonant, but underneath it ran other things: Rosalie's complicated, rarely acknowledged tenderness, Emmett's characteristic high spirits, Esme's renewed appreciation for every ordinary moment, Carlyle's patient vigilance, and Alice's quiet private wrestling with the limits of what she could see. Jasper moved through all of it gently, adjusting where he could with a light touch of long experience, not suppressing what his family felt, but helping the sharpest edges soften into something more manageable. It was the work he had always done for them, and he did it with the deep satisfaction of someone whose purpose and whose nature had finally, after a long and difficult journey, arrived at something like alignment. Emmett was the household's weather system in a different sense entirely. He was magnificent, and he knew it, and he found the aftermath of near disaster considerably less interesting than the near disaster itself had been, which was entirely in character. He redirected his considerable energy toward Bella, who was still in the extraordinary physical peak of her newborn months, and who remained, to Emmett's enormous and genuine delight, almost impossible to defeat in any test of strength he devised. The sounds of their contest drifted through the trees at odd hours, Emmett's booming laughter, Bella's startled responses to what her own body could now do. And the house received these sounds the way it received the river and the wind, as part of what it meant to be home. Rosalie did not speak of what the confrontation had cost her, because Rosalie did not speak of such things. She was someone who had been remade without her consent into something immortal and indestructible, and she had spent the subsequent decades maintaining, as an act of sheer will, the appearance of someone who needed nothing and feared nothing, and certainly did not permit herself to be shaken by events, however significant those events might be. But she had stood in that clearing with a clarity about the stakes that was among the most acute things she had ever experienced, and the clarity had left a mark. In the weeks that followed, she was simply more present. She chose the same rooms her family chose. She did not withdraw to her own spaces the way she sometimes did when the closeness of shared immortal life felt like too much. It was not a dramatic change, but the people who loved her noticed it. The way you notice a light coming on in a window you had grown accustomed to seeing dark. In the cottage through the trees, Edward and Bella were learning something neither of them had much prior experience with. They were learning to live without immediate crisis. They had come together in danger and urgency, and the particular electricity of impossible love, and that urgency had been their natural atmosphere for so long that its absence felt strange at first, almost suspect, the way deep silence sometimes makes you strain to hear what you might be missing. But the days passed, and the quiet held, and the peace revealed itself to be genuine. Edward sat often at the piano in the cottage's main room, playing at low volume in the evenings, and the music he made in those weeks was different from what had come before, less formally constructed, more honest, as though he was finally composing from a place of security rather than longing. This was the morning after forever, and for the first time in the long history of the Olympic Coven, they were not preparing to leave. They were learning, with the particular care of people unaccustomed to the practice, to stay. Volterra did not change. That was perhaps the most important thing to understand about the city that housed the oldest vampires in the world. It had been arranged, over the course of many centuries, to resist change entirely. The stone streets and terracotta rooftops, the particular quality of afternoon light falling across the central piazza, the tourists who came each year for the festival of St. Marcus and left without understanding what they had really been celebrating. All of it remained as it had been for generations of human memory, which meant it had remained effectively unchanged for the entirety of Aro's occupation of the castle at his heart. Aro understood, as few beings in history ever had the opportunity to learn, that permanence was its own form of power, that the appearance of immovable ancient authority was half of what made that authority real. Volterra did not change because Aro did not change, and Aro did not change because he had decided, somewhere in the long dim corridor of his first century of immortal life, that he was exactly what the world required him to be. He'd been right about that for 3,000 years. He saw no compelling reason to revise the assessment. And so, when the Volturi returned to Volterra from the clearing in Forks, they returned to a city that received them the same way it always had. With stone silence and the smell of old wood, and the particular coldness of underground corridors that no sunlight ever reached. The human staff moved through their routines. The guard resumed their positions. The great hall returned to its customary atmosphere of patient, absolute authority. Anyone observing from outside might have concluded that nothing significant had occurred, that the journey to the Pacific Northwest had been a routine matter, resolved in the routine way, the law upheld, and the Volturi returned to their ancient seat of power with their authority intact. Anyone observing from inside knew better. Aro sat in his chair at the center of the raised stone platform, and he was, outwardly, precisely as he had always been. Gracious, attentive, his pale hands folded in his lap with the careful stillness of someone who has mastered every signal his body might send. He smiled when smiling was appropriate. He spoke with a measured warmth that had always been his most disarming quality, the quality that had allowed him to accumulate 3,000 years of allies, without most of them ever quite realizing they had become something closer to subjects. He presided over the guard's return with the same ceremonial composure that characterized everything he did. But Aro was thinking. He was always thinking, in the way that only very old minds fully accustomed to the scope of centuries could think, not in the quick, reactive patterns of younger beings for whom urgency created its own momentum, but in long, slow arcs that might take decades to complete their curve. What had happened in that clearing was not, in the architecture of Aro's private understanding, a defeat. Defeat implied a contest, and what had occurred was closer to a recalibration. New information had arrived, more of it, and more consequential than he'd anticipated. And that information now needed to be absorbed, weighted, and integrated into the long game that he had been playing, in one form or another, for longer than most of the world's current civilizations had existed. The new information was substantial. The Olympic Coven had demonstrated an ability to assemble allies that surpassed anything Aro's surveillance had suggested was possible. Multiple covens, from multiple continents, bound by relationships of genuine loyalty, rather than the coerced compliance that the Volturi's own alliances were typically built upon. That distinction mattered. Coerced allies were reliable up to the precise point where their fear of the alternative was outweighed by the cost of compliance, and not a moment beyond. Genuine allies were a different thing entirely, less predictable in some respects, but far more durable in the circumstances that actually determine the outcome of confrontations. The witness loyalty in that clearing had not broken even under the specific pressure the Volturi were designed to apply. That was data. Aro filed it with the same meticulous precision with which he filed everything. There was also the matter of the shield. Aro had touched Bella Swan's hand in the clearing and received nothing. a smooth, impenetrable blankness where the thoughts of every other being he had ever touched had poured into him like water. He had known of her immunity before the confrontation, had factored it into his calculations as a minor complication, a single blocked avenue in what he expected to be a thoroughly navigable situation. What he had not fully accounted for was the shield's external range, the ability to extend a psychic barrier across multiple allies simultaneously, to neutralize Jane and Alec, his two most decisive weapons, the pair that had made the Volturi effectively unassailable in direct confrontation for centuries, was not a minor complication. It was a structural problem. It meant that the military logic the Volturi had relied upon for millennia, the logic that said their gifted guard made them essentially invincible in any direct engagement, did not hold against the Olympic Coven's current composition. That too was filed. That too would inform the calculation. Caius was less patient about what he considered the appropriate response to these new data points. Where Aro moved through the aftermath with the unhurried deliberation of a chess player content to think 10 moves ahead, Caius moved with the compressed fury of someone who had been made to look small in front of witnesses and had not yet found a satisfactory outlet for what that cost him. He was not stupid. None of the ancient three were stupid, and longevity had made them all, in various ways, wise. But Caius's wisdom had always been of the harder, less forgiving variety. He believed in the swift and overwhelming application of force as the only reliable guarantor of continued authority. The retreat from Forks had violated every principle he considered foundational to the Volturi's position, and he said so. In the private councils that took place in the weeks following the return, with characteristic bluntness. The law against immortal children existed, Caius argued, because the Volturi had made it exist through 3 centuries of absolute enforcement. The moment a hybrid child was permitted to stand in open contravention of that law, permitted not merely to exist, but to be defended, to be the proximate cause of the largest gathering of vampire witnesses in recorded history, to be the argument that sent the Volturi home without a single execution. That moment represented a precedent whose consequences Caius found deeply alarming. Other covens would note it. Other covens would draw conclusions from it about the enforceability of Volturi law and the reliability of Volturi authority. That was not a theoretical concern. That was the kind of structural erosion that, left unaddressed, accumulated across decades into something genuinely threatening. Aro listened to Caius with the attentive, respectful patience he always extended to his brother's counsel, and he did not disagree with the analysis. He disagreed only with the proposed response. Moving against the Olympic Coven now, with insufficient odds, and in the immediate aftermath of a public reversal that the assembled witnesses had observed and would report across their networks, would not restore authority. It would invite a second confrontation under conditions likely to be even less favorable than the first. Aro was many things, but he was not an entity who repeated mistakes. Marcus said very little, as Marcus generally did. He sat in his chair with the characteristic detachment of someone whose connection to the proceedings was maintained primarily out of obligation rather than interest. His dark eyes moving slowly across the room, reading the bonds between the beings present with the same effortless, involuntary clarity with which other vampires registered scent. Marcus's gift was relationship. He saw the invisible structures of connection and loyalty and love that bound beings to one another, read their density and their direction and their resilience the way a musician reads sheet music, not as an effort, but as a condition of his existence. In the clearing in Forks, he had read something he had not encountered in a very long time, perhaps ever. The bonds within the Olympic Coven's assembled allies had been extraordinary. Not merely the practical alliances of mutual interest that most vampire networks were constructed from, but genuine relationships, chosen and tended across years, of a density and complexity that spoke to a quality of connection he associated with the distant human memories he had mostly stopped consulting. He had reported this to Aro in the flat and unembellished way that was the only way Marcus reported anything. Aro had received it with the particular quality of attention that meant he was adding it to his permanent internal record. What the Volturi offered the world it governed was, at its most fundamental, the promise of order, not justice. Aro had never been especially interested in justice, which was a concept requiring a moral framework he found unnecessarily constraining, but order, which was a simpler and more durable thing. The laws existed to enforce the secrecy that kept vampires safe from the discovery and retribution of the human world, which vastly outnumbered them and which, if sufficiently motivated and organized, represented the only genuine existential threat to vampire existence. Every action the Volturi took was ultimately in service of this primary interest, whether it appeared that way from outside or not. Renesmee Cullen complicated the law in ways that Aro found genuinely irritating, which was itself a relatively rare experience for him. The prohibition against immortal children had been absolute and had been absolutely enforced for 3 centuries because the original children, human children turned into vampires, were genuinely uncontrollable, genuinely indiscriminate in their violence, genuinely incapable of the secrecy that the law existed to protect. They had been a categorical threat, and the law had treated them categorically. Renesmee was not those children. She was controlled, empathetic, rapidly developing intelligence and judgment, bound by love to beings who would enforce discretion on her behalf, even if she were not yet capable of it independently. She met none of the actual criteria the law had been designed to address. Aro could not move against her without making the political motivation of that action nakedly apparent to every vampire who had stood in that clearing and would now carry the story outward through their networks. And a Volturi action visibly driven by political desire rather than genuine law enforcement was a Volturi action that invited the kind of scrutiny that his authority did not benefit from. And so the Volturi's response, in the months and then years that followed the confrontation, was silence, not indifference. Aro was constitutionally incapable of indifference toward anything that intersected with his interests, and the Olympic Coven intersected with his interests significantly. But silence as strategy, which was a different thing entirely. He withdrew the more obvious elements of the surveillance that he had periodically maintained on Carlyle's family, which had the effect of suggesting to those watching for such things that the matter had been resolved and the Volturi's attention had moved elsewhere. He said nothing publicly about the confrontation, issued no formal acknowledgement of the encounter, made no declaration about the legal status of the hybrid child. Silence, in the architecture of Volturi political communication, was not emptiness. It was a message. The message it sent to the broader vampire world was that the Volturi had assessed the situation and chosen not to act, which could be interpreted, depending on the receiver's perspective, either as magnanimous restraint or as something the Volturi had not chosen at all. Aro preferred to leave that ambiguity intact. Ambiguity was its own form of control. What he did instead was quieter and more patient and, in the long calculation of centuries, more likely to be effective. He invested in information. He expanded the Volturi's network of informants and observers, not specifically or obviously focused on the Cullens, but structured so that any significant development in the Western American vampire world would reach Volterra efficiently. He was particularly attentive to the question of alliances, whether the bonds that had held in the clearing would maintain their strength across years of ordinary separation, or whether distance and time and the natural drift of vampire lives would erode them back toward the levels of loose acquaintance from which they had been assembled. Alliance networks built in crisis were not always alliance networks that survived prosperity. Aro had seen that pattern before many times across many centuries. He was patient enough to wait for it. Jane understood, in the way that Jane understood most things, immediately, completely, and with an emotional investment she was too proud to fully acknowledge. She had been neutralized in that clearing by a newborn shield, and the experience had left a mark on her that went considerably deeper than professional frustration. Jane's gift was the cornerstone of the Volturi's coercive power, the thing that made defiance not merely costly, but immediately, viscerally unthinkable. To have extended it at Bella Cullen and felt it simply stop, absorbed into nothing by that strange elastic barrier, was the closest thing to humiliation that Jane's particular psychology was capable of registering. She did not speak of it. She resumed her position within the guard with the same cold, precise competence she had always maintained. But she filed the experience with the same thoroughness that Aro filed information, and she drew from it the same conclusion that Aro had drawn, that the shield was the variable, and that the shield was Bella Cullen, and that Bella Cullen would improve with time. So with the Volturi's patience. The silence from Volterra was not peace. It had never been peace, and it would not become peace simply because years accumulated without incident. It was the silence of a very old mind taking a very long view, moving pieces on a board that most players could not see clearly enough to play on. Carlyle understood this. He had known Aro for centuries, had spent enough time in those stone corridors to have developed a genuine, if complicated, sense of how that ancient mind worked. He did not mistake the quiet for safety. He accepted it as the particular kind of breathing room that it was. Time, carefully bought by the extraordinary demonstration in that clearing. Time that could be used to build and strengthen and deepen the connections that had made the difference. It was, when examined clearly, a standoff. Not the dramatic, explicit standoff of two forces visibly facing each other across a field, but the quieter and more durable standoff of two parties who had each assessed the other and arrived at the same reluctant conclusion that the cost of direct conflict currently exceeded the potential return. That calculation could change. Both sides knew it could change. The work of preventing that change, for Carlyle, through the careful tending of every alliance, every relationship, every bond of genuine trust, was not dramatic work. It was patient, incremental, decades-long work. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of work that Carlisle Cullen had been doing his entire immortal life. The clearing near the cottage was quiet in the early mornings, before the rest of the family had fully settled into the rhythm of the day, before the sounds of the house carried through the trees. Bella had claimed this time deliberately in the weeks following the confrontation, returning to the same spot each morning with the focused intentionality of someone who has discovered a practice that matters and intends to take it seriously. She would stand at the center of the clearing, her feet on the cold ground, the mist still threading between the trees at that hour, and she would reach inward for the thing that was becoming, slowly and with great effort, hers to direct. The shield did not feel the way she would have expected in the early days of learning to touch it consciously. She had described it to Jasper once, searching for language adequate to the experience, and had landed on something like the image of a second skin. Not uncomfortable, not foreign, but present in the way that your own body is present, something you inhabit so completely that you do not notice it until you begin to pay attention. When she paid attention, she could feel its edges, the places where it ended and the world began. It breathed in its way, expanding slightly with each moment of calm focus and contracting when her concentration slipped. And learning to hold it deliberately extended was the work of many patient mornings alone in that clearing. She had been naturally shielded from the beginning, though she had not known it then. As a human, her immunity to certain vampire gifts had been simply a fact of her existence. Edward could not read her thoughts. Aro could not see her memories through touch. Jane's gift had broken against her without effect in the terrible moment in Italy when it should have brought her to her knees. None of this had felt like power during those human years. It had felt like a peculiarity, an anomaly, something that marked her as different without offering any obvious advantage. She had not been able to use it. She had not even been able to feel it. It was simply what she was, operating below the threshold of her own awareness, a locked room inside her that she did not yet have the key to enter. Becoming a vampire had given her the key. The transformation had sharpened everything: perception, sensation, the speed and depth of her cognitive processing. And among the things it sharpened was her awareness of her own inner landscape. She could feel the shield now the way she could feel her own stillness, her own strength, the particular quality of her vampire nature that was already, even in these early years, distinctly and recognizably her own. And feeling it meant she could begin to move it. Slowly, imprecisely at first, with the effortful concentration of someone learning to use a muscle they did not previously know they possessed. But the progress was real, and it was consistent, and each morning in the clearing she was able to extend the shield a little further, hold it a little longer, move it with a little more intention than the morning before. Jasper had been her most useful collaborator in understanding what the shield could and could not do. His gift operated in the same psychic register that hers defended, the invisible space of felt experience, of emotion and sensation transmitted between beings. And working with him had taught her things about the shield's mechanics that she could not have discovered alone. When he directed a gentle pulse of calm toward her, she could feel the shield absorb it, the way a wall absorbs sound, and nothing reached her. When she chose to thin the shield deliberately, opening a small and careful aperture, she could feel the calm arrive. Jasper's gift washing through that opening like light through a narrowed window. The precision required to do this was significant. It was not a switch, on or off. It was a dial, and learning the full range of its movements was slow work. That slowness was also the work of learning to trust. The shield, at its full involuntary strength, kept everything out. Every external psychic influence, every attempted intrusion, every gift directed at her with hostile or benign intent alike. All of it stopped at the boundary of what she was. To open it, even partially, even to someone she trusted completely, required a deliberate act of will that ran counter to the shield's natural inclination. She was, at her deepest level, someone whose inner world was extraordinarily her own. The shield was not separate from that. It was the expression of it, made visible and operational by her vampire nature. Teaching it to open was, in a meaningful sense, teaching herself to open, and that was not a lesson that could be rushed. The most significant development, the one that changed the emotional texture of her marriage in ways she had not anticipated and could not fully articulate even afterward, was learning to let Edward in. He had never been able to read her mind, not as a human, not as a vampire, not across all the months of their marriage, and the crisis, and the confrontation, and the long quiet that followed. He could read every person who had ever stood within range of his gift, their surface thoughts, their deeper currents, the whole involuntary broadcast of their inner lives. And from Bella, across all that time, he had received only silence. He had said more than once, and with evident sincerity, that he did not experience her immunity as a deprivation, that the mystery of her was part of what he loved, that the one mind he could not enter was the one he most wanted to understand, and that this wanting had kept him perpetually, helplessly attentive in ways he might not have been had she been as legible to him as everyone else. She believed him, but she also understood, in the way that she understood most important things about Edward, through careful, patient observation across years of closeness, that there was a quality of loneliness in his gift that he rarely spoke about directly. To be the one person in any room who heard everything, who received the uninvited broadcast of every passing mind, who could not turn it off and could not choose what arrived. That was not simply a power. It was also a condition of permanent, inescapable exposure to other people's interiority. And in the middle of all that involuntary noise, Bella had always been silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a closed door. He had spent over a century learning to live with other people's thoughts crowding his own. He had never, until Bella, had anything that functioned as genuine privacy. Letting him in was an act she prepared for over many weeks before she attempted it. She practiced in the clearing first, learning to thin the shield in a controlled and intentional way, learning to hold a small aperture open while maintaining the rest of the barrier intact. She wanted it to be a gift, not an accident. She wanted to offer it clearly, consciously, with full understanding of what she was doing and why. When she finally extended the shield toward Edward, opening it specifically and only for him, his response was not what she might have predicted from someone who had spent months being told what she was working toward. He went very still, not the ordinary stillness of a vampire at rest, but the particular stillness of someone receiving something they had waited for long enough that the arrival of it required a moment of full absorption before any response was possible. She could feel him then, in the way she imagined he felt other people. His presence in her mind, gentle and wondering, moving carefully, the way you move through a room you have been invited into for the first time and want to honor with your attention. It did not happen all at once. The full opening of the shield to him was a gradual thing. Practice across many mornings and evenings, deepening in stages as her control improved and her trust in the process settled into certainty. But from that first careful opening onward, something in the atmosphere of their marriage shifted in a way that was quiet and profound and difficult to name precisely. Edward had always known her through observation and conversation and the long accumulation of shared experience. Now he knew her the way he knew everyone else. From inside, immediately, without the mediation of language, and Bella, who had always lived most vividly in her own interior world, discovered that being known in this way was not the loss of privacy she had feared, but something closer to its completion. The tactical dimensions of her shield's development were real and significant, and Jasper was the one who thought most carefully about them. The range continued to expand across months of practice, from the handful of people she could cover in the clearing on those early mornings, to a wider perimeter that, with full concentration, could encompass a meaningful number of allies. The endurance improved in parallel, the effort required to maintain an extended shield decreasing steadily as the action became more practiced and more automatic. And the precision, the ability to cover specific individuals while leaving others out the barrier, to thin it selectively for particular gifts while maintaining it against others, became increasingly refined. What she could not do, she held clearly in mind, because clarity about limits was part of what made the rest of the practice honest. The shield was psychic. It stopped gifts that operated in the psychic register. Jane's pain illusion, Alec's sensory deprivation, Aro's thought reading, Edward's mind reading, any attempt to manipulate the inner experience of the person it covered. It did not stop physical force. It would not prevent a physical attack, would not cushion a blow, would not protect the body of anyone it covered from the direct application of physical violence. In a confrontation where the Volturi chose to engage physically rather than through their gifted guard, Bella's shield provided no defense. This was not a theoretical limitation. It was a real one, and she thought about it with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything she had learned to think about clearly. But in the confrontation that had actually occurred, in the confrontation that the Volturi's method of operating made most likely to recur, the shield was decisive. Jane and Alec together represented the Volturi's ability to neutralize opposition before physical engagement became necessary, to remove the will and the capacity to resist before a single physical blow was struck. Against a shielded Coven and his allies, that capacity simply did not function. And Bella, standing in her clearing in the early morning mist, practicing the expansion and precision and endurance of the thing she carried, understood that this was her contribution to the family's safety in a way that nothing else she could have offered would have been. She had come to vampirism feeling beneath the genuine gratitude and the love, a quiet and persistent uncertainty about whether she had earned the life she had been given, whether the transformation had been something she deserved, or something she had stumbled into through proximity to people who were extraordinary in ways she was not. The shield, growing under her deliberate attention into something increasingly remarkable, did not resolve that uncertainty through pride or self-congratulation. It resolved it more simply than that. It was hers. It had always been hers, and she was learning, morning by morning in the quiet clearing, to use it fully. Consider what it means to make a promise without an ending. Human marriage, in all its forms across all its cultures and centuries, has always been made in the shadow of mortality. The vow contains its own horizon. We have this one life, the promise says, implicitly, in the space between the spoken words, and we are choosing to spend it together. That horizon is not incidental to the promise. It is part of what gives the promise its weight, its urgency, its particular beauty. The fact that time is limited makes the choice to share it feel significant in a way that unlimited time, theoretically, might not. Edward and Bella had made their promises in a gazebo in the rain, surrounded by the people they loved, and the promises they made were the same words humans had been saying to each other for centuries. But the horizon was gone. There was no shadow of mortality behind the vow, no implicit ending built into the choosing. What stretched ahead of them was not a lifetime, but something that had no agreed-upon word in the human vocabulary. Something that encompassed centuries the way a human life encompassed decades, vast and open and fundamentally unlike anything either of them had been given a model for understanding. They had to invent it as they went. That was, in the end, what the early decades of their marriage actually were. A long and genuine and sometimes awkward process of discovering what love looked like when you removed the urgency that mortality had always provided, and found that it looked like something quieter and more interesting than either of them had anticipated. The first years were characterized by a closeness that was almost gravitational in its intensity. They had come to marriage through such sustained crisis, through such prolonged danger and uncertainty, and the specific terror of nearly losing each other in ways both ordinary and extraordinary, that the simple fact of being safe together carried an emotional charge that required no augmentation. They were learning, simultaneously, what it meant to be vampires together and what it meant to be married. And the two educations were so deeply intertwined that it was difficult afterward to separate which lessons had come from which source. They learned that they moved well together physically, that their vampire natures, which had made certain ordinary human interactions complicated or impossible during Bella's human years, now made them genuinely, gracefully equal in a way that still surprised her sometimes with its completeness. They learned that Edward's habit of careful, watchful attention, the tendency that had sometimes felt during her human years, like protectiveness shading into control, shifted in character when its object was no longer fragile. He was still attentive. He was still, by nature, someone who noticed everything about the people he loved. But the quality of his attention changed when it no longer carried the constant undertone of fear for her safety, when he could watch her and simply see her, rather than watching her and measuring the distance between her and the nearest threat. For Edward, the marriage represented something he had not been able to fully articulate even to himself during the long years of solitude that had preceded it. He was someone who had spent over a century in an unusual and specific kind of isolation, surrounded by family, genuinely loved and loving in return, never physically alone, and yet set apart by the nature of his gift in a way that no amount of closeness could entirely bridge. He heard thoughts. He heard them constantly, involuntarily, the continuous interior broadcast of every mind within range, a noise he had learned to filter and manage but could never entirely silence. And in the middle of that permanent, inescapable access to other people's inner lives, Bella had been silent. Her mind, closed to him from the first moment he encountered her, had been the one place his gift could not reach, and the effect of that single closed door in a world of perpetually open ones had been. He understood it only in retrospect, with the clarity that distance provides, something very close to relief. Loving her had always contained this paradox, that the person he wanted most to understand was the one person he could not read, that every insight he had into her came through the ordinary human instruments of observation and conversation, and the slow accumulation of shared experience, the same instruments available to anyone who loved her. In some ways, this had made him more attentive than he might otherwise have been. When you cannot hear what someone is thinking, you learn to watch very carefully. He had watched Bella Gilbert carefully for years, and what he had learned through watching was more nuanced and more complete than anything a direct reading of her thoughts might have provided, because it was knowledge earned through genuine attention rather than received passively. And then she had learned to open the shield. The first time she extended it deliberately to include him, that careful, intentional opening she had practiced for weeks before offering. He had gone still in a way that was different from ordinary vampire stillness. It was the stillness of someone receiving something they had not allowed themselves to want too explicitly, because wanting it too explicitly, while it remained unavailable, would have been its own particular kind of pain. Her mind, when it opened to him, was exactly what he should have expected, and nothing like what he had imagined. Rich and specific and deeply, recognizably her own, the same quality of interior life that had expressed itself in the person he had fallen in love with, now accessible in its original form, rather than through the translations she had offered in conversation. He moved through it carefully, as you move through a space you have been trusted with. And Bella, who had always assumed that being known so directly would feel like exposure, found instead that it felt like being fully met for the first time. This opening became part of the private language of their marriage. Not constant, she was still, at her foundation, someone whose inner world was her own and who valued that ownership deeply, but chosen, deliberate, offered in the moments when she wanted him to know something that language was insufficient to carry. It was, of all the developments of their immortal life together, the one that changed the texture of their daily closeness most profoundly. The question of what two people do with centuries of shared time is one that no human philosophy had ever needed to fully address, and Edward and Bella answered it the way most real questions get answered. Not all at once, in a grand declaration, but gradually, through the accumulation of ordinary choices made across ordinary days. Edward returned to his music with a freedom he had not previously permitted himself. He had always composed. Music had been his most private form of expression across the long century of his immortal life. The place where the things he could not say found a form they could inhabit. But but his composing had always carried underneath it a quality of longing, of reaching towards something just out of range. In the settled years of his marriage, that quality changed. The music he made in the cottage's main room, at hours when Bella was reading nearby or simply present in the same space, was more complete than what had come before. Less structurally perfect, perhaps, in the formal sense. Less careful, less defended, more honest. Bella became his first audience in a way that no one had previously been, because she was the only one whose response he could not know in advance. Everyone else's reactions arrived to him before they were expressed. He heard the thought before he saw the face, which meant that responses, however genuine, always came to him slightly pre-processed, slightly anticipated. Bella's reactions were immediate and unfiltered and genuinely surprising, and the effect of that on his relationship with his own creative work was significant in ways he found difficult to explain, but returned to, gratefully, again and again. Bella's own intellectual life expanded across the decades in ways that suited her particular temperament exactly. She had always been more comfortable in books than at parties, more interested in understanding things deeply than in accumulating a wide range of surface experiences, and immortality gave her something that her human life, perpetually complicated by crisis and danger and the urgent demands of survival, had never reliably provided: time. Uninterrupted, unhurried time to read everything she had always meant to read, to study the languages she had encountered only at their edges, to follow the threads of philosophy and history and biology that had always interested her into their deeper territories. She became, across the decades, extraordinarily educated, not in the formal, credentialed sense, though she pursued that as well, in various institutions under various names, but in the older sense of someone whose mind has been genuinely formed by sustained engagement with ideas over a long period of time. Languages came first, because they were immediately useful, and because she had always had a natural facility that her human years had not given her adequate time to develop. She learned Italian with Edward, practicing in the evenings, finding a pleasure in the process that surprised her with its simplicity. Just the two of them, and a language and the quiet cottage, and no particular urgency attached to any of it. French followed, then Spanish refined past the basic competency she had carried from high school, then the more demanding projects of languages with entirely different grammatical architectures. Each new language felt like a new room in a house she was still discovering the full extent of. The tensions that existed between them were real, because they were real people in a real marriage, and real marriages contain friction as inevitably as they contain love. Edward's tendency toward protectiveness, toward positioning himself between Bella and anything that might harm her, toward managing information he judged potentially distressing, toward decisions that prioritized her safety over her autonomy, did not disappear with her transformation. It adapted. He was no longer afraid for her physical safety in the way he had been when she was human and breakable, but the protective instinct itself was too deeply woven into his nature to simply dissolve. Bella, whose stubbornness was equally fundamental to who she was, continued to require that her autonomy be honored, continued to resist the gentle management he sometimes defaulted to without fully realizing he was doing it. These were not crises. They were the recurring negotiations of two people with strong and somewhat contrary natures, learning to make a shared life that genuinely accommodated both of them. What made those negotiations possible across decades of practice was the same thing that had always been the foundation of what they were to each other. A quality of genuine mutual regard that went beyond the urgencies of romantic love into something more durable and more honest. Edward had always seen Bella clearly, had loved what he saw rather than a projection of what he wanted her to be, and she had returned that quality of attention with a steadiness that his century of loneliness had made more precious to him than he could easily articulate. Being truly seen by someone across a long period of time is not a small thing. Being chosen again, daily, by someone who knows you fully, not the version of you that you present to the world, but the actual interior person with all its complications and contradictions, is not a small thing. It is for most people in most lives the largest thing available to them. For Edward and Bella, it was available across centuries, and they did not take it lightly. The decades accumulated quietly, marked not by the dramatic punctuations of crisis, but by the ordinary accumulations of a shared life. Conversations that stretched across evenings, music made and received, languages learned and books read, and the slow deepening of an understanding between two people who had decided, completely and without reservation, that each other was where they wanted to be. Humans said that love faded with familiarity, that the urgency of early feeling could not be sustained, that intimacy eventually shaded into comfort, and comfort into a kind of pleasant numbness, the presence of a person becoming so habitual that it ceased to register as choice. Edward and Bella discovered the opposite. Given sufficient time and genuine partnership, love did not fade with familiarity. It deepened, the way rivers deepen as they find their course, cutting more slowly but more surely into the landscape they move through. What had once been urgent became steady. What had once been passionate became vast. They were each other's home in the fullest sense of that word. Not a place you arrive at, but a place you carry with you that exists wherever you are because the person who makes it home is present. That was the immortal marriage. Not a single promise made in a gazebo in the rain, but the same promise, renewed in small and ordinary ways across every day of every decade that followed. The treaty between the Cullens and the Quileute had never been a simple document. It had begun, in its original form, as a boundary, agreement between two groups who distrusted each other completely and had arrived, through the particular logic of mutual deterrence, at the practical conclusion that coexistence was preferable to the alternative. The Cullens would not hunt on Quileute land. The Cullens would not bite humans. In exchange, the Quileute wolves would not expose the Cullens to the human world, and both parties would maintain the careful distance that kept the arrangement functional. It was not a friendship. It was a ceasefire, formalized across a handshake and preserved across decades by the fact that both sides found violation too costly to seriously contemplate. That original treaty, with its clean boundary lines and its mutual suspicion held in careful equilibrium, bore almost no resemblance to what existed between the Cullens and the Quileute in the years following Breaking Dawn. The formal terms remained, the land boundaries, the prohibition against biting humans, the mutual secrecy. But the spirit of the arrangement had been so thoroughly transformed by everything that had occurred that calling it the same treaty felt like a category error. What existed now was something considerably more complicated and considerably more real. Jacob Black had made it complicated and real in the most irreversible way available to a werewolf. The imprint was not a diplomatic arrangement. It was not a chosen alliance or a negotiated relationship or anything that either party had consented to in advance. It was simply a fact of Jacob's nature operating according to the same deep logic that governed the wolf gene across generations of Quileute bloodline. And it had bound him to Renesmee Cullen with a completeness that made the original treaty's careful boundary lines look almost quaint by comparison. Jacob was, in the most meaningful sense, family. Not by adoption, not by legal arrangement, not through the careful extension of goodwill across a managed distance. Family in the way that the wolves understood family, through bond, through presence, through the daily reality of showing up. And if Jacob was family, then the wolves, by extension, were something the treaty had never originally contemplated. Not enemies held at a respectful distance, not allies of convenience assembled for a specific crisis. Something more textured and more permanent than either of those categories could contain. Carlyle understood this with the clarity he brought to most things, and he was grateful for it, even as he recognized its complications. The Quileute connection represented exactly the kind of deep, locally rooted relationship that made the Olympic Coven genuinely difficult to approach without consequence. The Volturi operated on the assumption that vampire covens were ultimately separable from their environments, that alliances were portable, that geography was incidental, that a coven could be isolated from its context and addressed directly. The Cullens, with their wolf treaty, transformed into something closer to kinship, and their deep roots in the specific landscape of the Olympic Peninsula resisted that assumption at a structural level. You could not simply appear in Forks and move against the Cullen family without the Quileute knowing within hours. That was not a tactical consideration. That was a fact of the life that had grown up around the treaty. But the complications were real, and they deserved honest acknowledgement. The wolves aged when they stopped phasing. This was the biological truth at the center of everything complicated about the long-term relationship between the Cullens and the pack, and it was a truth that played out across the decades following Breaking Dawn with a bittersweet clarity that no one in the family found easy to sit with. The wolves, who chose to phase regularly, maintaining the wolf gene's expression in their bodies, remained young. The wolves who chose to stop, to step back from the pack life and build ordinary, human existences, to marry and have children and grow old alongside the people they loved, aged as all humans age, and eventually died as all humans die. Sam Woolley was the first. He'd made his choice years before the confrontation with the Volturi, in the quiet private moment when he had decided that Emily and the life he was building with her mattered more than the frozen youth that continued phasing would provide. He had stepped back from the alpha role, had passed that weight to Jacob, and had chosen mortality with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who knows exactly what he values and is not interested in apologizing for it. The Cullens watched him age across the years that followed, watched his hair silver and the lines deepen in his face, watched him become the kind of man whose presence carried the particular authority of someone who has chosen his life deliberately and lived it fully. Emily aged beside him, and their children grew, and the life they had built in the small house on the reservation took on the dense, layered quality of something genuinely lived in. When Sam died, in his early 70s, peacefully and at home, it was the first time the Cullen family grieved the death of someone from the Quileute world in the way they had previously grieved only their own losses. Esme felt it particularly. She had built relationships with the people on the reservation across the years of deepened connection, had brought food during illness, and sat with people in difficulty with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to everything. And Sam's death registered with her as the death of a neighbour in the fullest sense. Someone whose daily existence had been part of the fabric of her own. It would not be the last such grief. The Cullens were beginning to learn, in those years, what it meant to love people who aged. Leah Clearwater's future remained the most genuinely open question in the post-Breaking Dawn world of the treaty relationship. She was a singular figure in the history of the Quileute wolves, the only woman in recorded memory to carry the wolf gene to full expression, a fact that her own experience of the transformation had made clear was not the straightforward gift it might have appeared. She had phased involuntarily, triggered by the particular grief and betrayal of losing Sam to Emily, and her wolf nature had arrived not as a chosen power, but as a consequence of pain. She was faster than most of the other wolves, her gift sharp and her temper sharper, and she had carried a difficulty in her that the years had softened without entirely resolving. The question of what Leah would choose, whether to keep phasing and remain young, or to stop and take the ordinary human mortality that came with that choice, was one she did not answer quickly. She was not someone who made decisions for the sake of being decisive. She'd been shaped by experiences that had taught her, at some cost, that certainty arrives slowly and was worth waiting for. What was clear across the years was that she was building something. Her own path, separate from the pack dynamics that had defined her early wolf years, separate from the grief and anger that had characterized her transformation. Where that path led was hers to determine, and the Cullens had enough respect for her particular kind of strength to leave the question with her. Seth remained, across all the years that followed, the clearest expression of what the relationship between the wolves and the Cullens could be at its most uncomplicated. He had liked the Cullens from the beginning with the immediate, uncritical warmth of someone who simply took people as they were and found them interesting, and the years had not altered that quality in him. He moved between the two worlds, wolfpack and vampire family, with an ease that occasionally baffled both sides and consistently delighted Emmett, who had adopted Seth as something between a little brother and a particularly entertaining project. Seth's eventual choice about phasing would be his own, made in his own time, but his presence in the Cullens' extended world remained a consistent and genuinely warm fact across the decades. The treaty's formal terms evolved slowly and carefully, negotiated in the way that all important things between the Cullens and the Quileute were negotiated, through direct conversation, through the patient building of understanding across specific situations, without the pressure of crisis to distort the process. The original boundary lines, which had been drawn in a context of mutual suspicion between parties who did not know each other well, were revisited across the years with the accumulated goodwill of people who had stood in a clearing together and held their ground. They remained meaningful, The Quileute territory remained Quileute territory, and the Cullens respected that with the same consistency they had always maintained. But their spirit shifted. They became lines that were honored because of what they represented, the sovereignty of a community and a culture that deserved that recognition, rather than lines that were honored because violation would trigger consequences. New generations of Quileute children were born across the decades, and some of them carried the wolf gene, and some did not. And the question of whether any given generation would produce wolves at all was one that even the most careful study of the bloodline could not reliably answer in advance. The gene was recessive and unpredictable, expressing itself in response to environmental triggers that the tribe had come to understand with more nuance over time. When new wolves emerged, young and frightened and suddenly transformed in ways they had not been prepared for, it was not unusual for Jacob to bring them to the Cullens, or more specifically to Carlisle, whose calm and whose centuries of experience with the complexities of supernatural existence made him an unexpectedly useful resource for people newly arrived in a nature they had not chosen. These conversations between Carlisle and new wolves were among the most quietly significant things that happened in the ongoing life of the treaty relationship. They were not formal. They were not part of any written arrangement. They happened in the Cullen kitchen, generally, with Carlisle sitting across the table from a young person who was still processing the seismic shift in their understanding of what they were, offering the same thing he had always offered everyone who came to him in that condition: unhurried attention, honest information, and the specific comfort of being in the presence of someone who had been living with the impossible long enough to have found it navigable. This was what the treaty had become across the years. Not a ceasefire, not a boundary agreement maintained by mutual deterrence. Something that had grown through specific relationships and specific choices and the daily practice of showing up for each other across lines that had once seemed uncrossable, into a form of genuine kinship. It required maintenance, the way all real relationships required maintenance. The ongoing work of attention and honesty, and the willingness to navigate difficulty without retreating behind formal terms. But it held. Across the years and the generational changes and the losses and the new beginnings, it held. And the Cullens, who had always known that their most important protection was never military but relational, tended it with the same patient care they brought to everything that mattered most to them. Every 10 years or so, they disappeared. Not dramatically. The Cullens had never done anything dramatically if a quieter alternative existed. There was no announcement, no visible departure, no single morning when the neighbors might have noticed the house standing empty and the cars gone from the driveway. It happened gradually, the way the Cullens did most things. A reduction in visible activity, a gentle withdrawal from the social fabric of wherever they had been, and then simply an absence where a presence had been. The house would go on the market, handled by a real estate attorney in Seattle or Portland, who asked no particular questions, and the Cullen family would resurface somewhere else. A different state, sometimes a different country, carrying new names and new cover stories, and the same faces they had always carried, unchanged by the years that had visibly marked everyone around them. They had been doing this for the better part of a century before the events of Breaking Dawn, and they continued doing it afterward. The necessity had not changed. the world was full of people with good memories, and a family that did not age could not remain in one place long enough for those good memories to become a problem. What had changed was the texture of the leaving and the returning, the emotional weight of the cycle now that roots had been put down in forks in ways that made each departure feel different from the ones before. They always came back to forks. That was the new fact, the thing that distinguished the decades following breaking dawn from the preceding century of perpetual relocation. They would go to a city in northern Canada for several years, to a remote property in Scotland where Carlyle had professional connections, to a brief and carefully managed residency in a university town in New England, where several of them pursued academic credentials under new names. And then they would return to the house by the river, to the mist and the old-growth trees, and the specific quality of light in the Pacific Northwest that Esme had stopped pretending she did not prefer to any other light she had known. They returned because there was something here that the decades of movement had never produced anywhere else. A genuine home, in the fullest sense of that word, anchored by relationships and history and the particular knowledge that this place knew them. Carlyle's relationship with medicine deepened across the decades in ways that were, for him, among the most quietly profound developments of his long, immortal life. He had been a physician for the better part of 4 centuries, and the medicine he had practiced at the beginning of that period bore so little resemblance to what he practiced now that they might as well have been different disciplines entirely. He had watched the field transform across his lifetime with the specific appreciation of someone who understood both what had been known before and what had been gained, who remembered what it meant to practice medicine without the ability to image the interior of a living body, without the understanding of infection that germ theory had eventually provided, without the pharmacological tools that the 20th century had developed with extraordinary speed. Each new development had registered with him not as an abstraction, but as a direct expansion of what he could do for the person in front of him. The specific human being lying on a table or sitting across a desk, whose life he was trying to extend or improve or simply make less painful. By the decades following breaking dawn, Carlyle had accumulated clinical experience that no human physician could have approached, not in depth of knowledge, which human physicians could also develop across long careers, but in the sheer breadth of experience across different eras of medical practice, across different patient populations in different parts of the world, across the full arc of a field that had remade itself multiple times within his own professional lifetime. He was careful with this, as he was careful with everything that might attract attention. He published occasionally, under various names, contributions to medical literature that were recognized by colleagues as reflecting unusual insight without raising questions about their origin. He trained young physicians with a patience that they invariably described as remarkable, not understanding that its source was centuries rather than temperament, though the temperament was genuine as well. Alice moved through the decades with a restless, purposeful energy that was entirely characteristic of her and entirely her own. Her gift had been a source of deep discomfort in the period immediately following the confrontation. The experience of her blind spots had marked her in ways that took time to process. But time and practice and the sustained engagement with the mechanics of her own vision had brought her to a place of more nuanced relationship with what she could and could not see. she understood its grammar better than she had before. She knew its edges with the specific clarity of someone who had tested them against a real situation with real consequences. And that knowledge, though it had arrived painfully, made her more effective rather than less. Her role in the Coven remained what it had always been, an early warning system of extraordinary sensitivity, oriented perpetually toward the future, filtering the infinite near possibilities of what might happen through the specific decisions of specific beings, and delivering useful information from that process with a speed and accuracy that no other early warning system available to the family could approach. And alongside that, she continued to find genuine pleasure in the things she had always found pleasure in: beauty, design, the particular satisfaction of a well-executed plan, Jasper, the small daily victories of aesthetic existence. She was not, despite the seriousness of her gifts' implications, a serious person in her daily texture. She was someone who enjoyed being alive with the specific intensity of someone who had chosen that enjoyment as a practice. Jasper's evolution across the decades was quieter and, in some ways, more significant than most of the family recognized. His history was the most violent among them. He had lived his newborn years in the worst possible context, had been shaped by a vampire world that operated on entirely different principles from the one Carlyle had built, and the scars of that formation were not invisible to people who knew where to look. The decades following Breaking Dawn represented, for Jasper, the longest sustained period of stability he had known in his immortal life. No immediate crisis, no proximity to the human blood that had always tested his control most severely, no performance of certainty he did not actually feel, just the ongoing daily practice of being the person he had been working toward for decades. His control improved across those years in ways that he experienced not as the resolution of a problem, but as the gradual deepening of a practice. He was not cured of anything. He was not free of the particular sensitivity that made human blood more compelling to him than to most of the family. But the distance between that sensitivity and his behavior grew year by patient year, until the gap was wide enough to hold comfortably without constant vigilance. Though the vigilance never entirely ceased, he had come to accept that it would not, and to find in that acceptance not defeat, but something more honest. A realistic relationship with his own nature that he trusted more than any claim of complete resolution would have allowed. Emmett's relationship with time was the most straightforwardly joyful thing in the household, and the family had learned across the decades to appreciate this without qualification. He was someone who encountered each new era with the same enormous, uncomplicated enthusiasm he had brought to every previous one, finding in the changing landscape of human culture and technology and recreation an inexhaustible source of things to be interested in and competitive about. The arrival of new sports, extreme variations on existing forms, newly invented disciplines, anything requiring physical intensity and preferably an element of risk, was reliably exciting to Emmett in ways that the family found reassuring in their very consistency. He was the household's most reliable point of contact with the present tense, always current, always engaged, never tempted to live primarily in the long past the way longer-lived vampires sometimes were. Rosalie carried her grief across the decades with a dignity that was, for those who understood what she was carrying, one of the more remarkable things about her. the desire for humanity, for the human life she had been denied, for the children she would never have, for the ordinary mortal future that had been taken from her before she had a chance to fully inhabit it, did not resolve with time in the way that other kinds of grief sometimes did. It softened. It became something she carried rather than something that actively defined her, a weight she had learned to distribute across her days rather than something concentrated in a single unbearable point. She spoke of it more easily as the decades passed. To Alice, to Esme, occasionally to Bella, who understood in a different but genuine way what it meant to hold grief for a road not taken alongside a life that was, by any honest measure, also rich and real. These conversations were not dramatic. They were the ordinary conversations of people who love each other and are honest with each other across a long time, and they mattered. The mechanics of their movement through the human world became more demanding with each passing decade, as the systems designed to identify and track human beings grew more sophisticated. Photography had been the first challenge of that kind. The sudden proliferation of recorded images in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had required a new level of care about where they appeared and under what circumstances. Film, and then digital photography, had deepened that challenge. The arrival of comprehensive digital records, databases linking names and faces and identification numbers across governmental and institutional systems, required the most sophisticated identity management the family had ever undertaken. With Alice's gift oriented specifically toward the question of when and where their current identities would begin to attract scrutiny. They adapted as they had always adapted. Each new challenge was met with the same patient, practical intelligence that had allowed them to move through the world without detection for the better part of a century. Carlyle maintained relationships with a small number of trusted humans across the decades, people who understood something of what they were dealing with and who had reasons of their own, generally financial but occasionally more complex, to assist with the management of identities and records. These relationships were handled with extraordinary care because the humans involved carried information that could be genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands, and because Carlyle's ethical commitments meant that coercion was never an option. Trust had to be genuine. It was accordingly rare and carefully tended. The family's identity remained beneath all the surface changes of name and location and institutional affiliation, essentially and recognizably itself. This was perhaps the most important thing about the Cullens across the decades, that the movement and the reinvention and the perpetual adaptation to new circumstances never reached the core of what they were to each other. They changed everything that needed to be changed, and they preserved everything that mattered. Carlyle's compassion and his philosophy of what immortal life could be, Esme's warmth and her particular gift for making any space a home, Alice's vision and her brightness, Jasper's quiet depth and his steadiness, Emmett's joy, Rosalie's fierce protectiveness, Edward's music and his attention, Bella's stubborn, grounded, increasingly confident presence at the center of her own life. These things did not change. The world changed around them decade by decade, and they changed within it. And what remained was the family, chosen, renewed, the same essential thing it had always been beneath every new name they wore. There is a theory never formally articulated but understood intuitively by most vampires who had thought carefully about the nature of their kind, that the gifts a vampire carries into immortality are not random. They are not assigned, not bestowed by some external force with particular intentions. They emerge instead from what was already present, from the deepest grain of a person's human nature, the most essential qualities of who they were before the transformation took everything and compressed it and returned it in a form that was permanent and intensified and no longer constrained by the ordinary limitations of human biology. The transformation did not create gifts from nothing. It found what was already there and made it visible, operable, available in ways that human existence had never quite permitted. Edward's profound empathy and his compulsive attention to other people's inner lives became the ability to read those lives directly. Alice's intuition, that quality of knowing things before she could explain how she knew them, of living slightly ahead of the present moment, became genuine precognition, the future arriving to her in images rather than hunches. Jasper's extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional atmosphere of every room he entered, the awareness that had made him both a devastatingly effective military leader and a person in considerable private pain, became the ability to feel and influence the emotions of every being around him. Bella's rich, intensely private inner world, the interiority that had always been more vivid and more complex than she found easy to share, became a shield. Understanding this, understanding that the gifts were always expressions of identity rather than additions to it, was essential to understanding how those gifts developed across decades and centuries of use. A gift practiced for 50 years by someone who understood it deeply was not the same gift it had been at 5 years, used instinctively and imprecisely by someone still learning what they carried. The fundamental nature remained constant. The range, the precision, the nuance of application, the understanding of edges and limits and optimal conditions, all of this deepened with time in the way that any genuine skill deepens with sustained attentive practice. Edward's mind reading had been, in his early decades, an experience closer to submersion than to navigation. Thoughts arrived constantly, uninvited, from every mind within range, a continuous inundation that he had learned to manage through what amounted to an internal filtering system developed across his first century of immortal life. By the decades following breaking dawn, that filtering system had become extraordinarily refined. He could move through a crowded human environment and attend selectively, pulling specific threads from the surrounding noise, following particular minds with precision, identifying patterns across multiple simultaneous sources in a way that the younger version of himself, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of what arrived, would not have been able to attempt. More significantly, he had developed what might be called a fluency in the grammar of human thought, an understanding of how minds moved, of the relationship between what a person thought and what they meant, of the gap between conscious and preconscious processing that existed in every human mind he had ever encountered. A thought, he had learned, was rarely its own complete statement. It was the visible surface of something deeper, and what lived below the surface was often more important than what broke into conscious expression. After more than a century and a half of reading the surface, he had developed the ability to read the depth. This was not a different gift. It was the same gift, worked into something considerably more precise by the accumulation of practice and understanding across time. Alice experienced the development of her gift as the gradual learning of a language she had been born speaking, but had never formally studied. She had always seen the future, had woken to her vampire life with no human memories and an immediate, disorienting flood of visions that had taken years to learn to inhabit without being overwhelmed by. The visions operated according to a logic she had understood intuitively from the beginning, without being able to articulate it clearly. They showed decisions rather than fixed outcomes, the future as a probability space that shifted and realigned with every choice that every relevant person made. A vision was not a certainty. It was the most likely outcome given current trajectories, and it changed when trajectories changed, sometimes gradually, and sometimes with the sudden completeness of a river finding a new course. What decades of practice gave her was not the ability to control the visions. They remained as involuntary as Edward's mind reading, arriving without invitation and departing without permission. What it gave her was the ability to interrogate them, to ask better questions of what she saw, to understand the conditions under which a particular future was most and least stable, to read the quality of a vision, its clarity, its consistency across multiple viewings, as a measure of how firmly the relevant decisions had been made. She had developed, in essence, a critical relationship with her own gift, which was considerably more useful than a simply receptive one. She no longer just received what the future offered. She engaged with it, tested it, understood its grammar well enough to know when it was telling her something reliable, and when the image she was seeing was contingent on decisions that might shift in the next hour. The blind spots remained. She could not see the wolves, could not see Renesmee, could not see any being whose nature placed them outside the parameters her gift operated within. These limitations did not shrink with time, but her understanding of them became more precise. She knew the specific shape of her blindness now, which was different from simply knowing that the blindness existed. Knowing the shape of what you cannot see allows you to make inferences about it, to approach the edges of the blind spot from the sides it is visible from, and draw conclusions about what the center must contain. She was not passive in the face of what her gift could not show her. She worked around it with the same focused pragmatism she brought to everything she found difficult. Jasper's gift was the most ethically complicated of the families, and the decades following Breaking Dawn were characterized by his increasingly deliberate and refined approach to the question of when and how it should be used. He could alter the emotional state of every being around him, could induce calm or unease, confidence or doubt, a range of feeling that covered most of the emotional spectrum available to the supernatural beings he moved among. This was a power that admitted of almost no oversight beyond his own judgment, because its operation was largely invisible to those it acted upon. People rarely knew when Jasper was influencing their emotional state. They simply felt differently than they had a moment before, and attributed it to their own interior processes. He had developed, across the decades, a personal code that he applied to the use of his gift with the rigor of someone who understood what it meant to hold a power that could not be externally checked. Within the family, he used it lightly and always toward ease, smoothing the sharpest, edges of grief or fear or conflict, not to prevent his family from feeling what they needed to feel, but to prevent feeling from becoming overwhelming in moments when overwhelming served no one. Outside the family, his restraint was considerably greater. He did not use the gift on humans as a matter of general practice, regardless of how useful a targeted pulse of calm might have been in any given social situation. The principle was not that the gift was wrong to use, but that its use on people who had not consented to it and could not detect it required a justification specific enough and serious enough to clear a bar that ordinary convenience did not reach. He applied it in genuine emergencies. In the confrontation in the clearing, he had used it with tactical precision, working alongside the assembled allies to maintain the emotional steadiness that the situation required. In interactions with new wolves brought to Carlisle by Jacob, he occasionally used it with light, careful intention to ease the specific panic of young people newly arrived in a supernatural nature they had not chosen. These were uses he could defend, that met the bar he had set for himself. He held the bar firmly, and the holding of it across decades was itself a form of the practice that was shaping him into something more settled and more trustworthy than what he had been. Bella's shield continued to develop along the lines established in her earliest years of practice, deepening in range and endurance and precision with the same steady consistency that had characterized its growth from the beginning. By the later decades, covering a significant number of allies simultaneously with the shield required an effort that was real but manageable. Comparable, she sometimes thought, to holding a difficult yoga pose, something that required genuine physical engagement, but not the maximum of what she was capable of. She was nowhere near that maximum, and she had come to understand that she might never reach it, that the ceiling of what the shield could do was probably higher than she would have time to explore, even across centuries of practice. That was not frustrating. It was interesting. The quality that a gift with genuine depth had of always offering more to learn. What the family's collective gifts created, considered together and in their interactions with each other, was a defensive and perceptive capability that had no precise equivalent anywhere else in the vampire world. Edward's mind reading and Alice's precognition operated in complementary registers, present and future, what is happening now and what is likely to happen next. And the combination of the two gave the Coven an informational richness that most vampire groups could not approach. Bella's shield protected the Coven's most sensitive members from the psychic attacks most likely to be used against them. Jasper's emotional gift maintained the interior stability of the group under pressure in the ways that had tactical implications beyond what any purely physical capability could provide. These were not independent assets that happened to coexist. They were a system, one that had been refined across years of living and working together into something more integrated and more effective than any individual component could have been in isolation. Carlisle had, across the decades, continued his quiet work of mapping the gifted vampire world beyond the Olympic Coven's immediate circle. He maintained correspondence with Eleazar, who had spent years in the Volturi's service, and whose gift for identifying and classifying supernatural abilities in others was itself extraordinary. Their letters across the decades constituted something like an ongoing research project, a careful accumulation of knowledge about what gifts existed how they operated, what their ranges and limitations were, and how they might interact with each other in circumstances that neither coven had yet encountered. Knowledge of this kind was its own form of preparation, not military preparation, not the assembly of a fighting force, but the kind of preparation that came from understanding the landscape you were moving through. The gifts were expressions of identity, deepened by time, and the Cullens, who had more time than almost any other family in their world, used it well. There is a particular kind of thinking that becomes available only after a very long time. Humans plan in increments scaled to the length of a human life. 5 years, 10 years, the span of a career or a child's growing up, or a mortgage paid down to nothing. These are the natural units of human temporal imagination, shaped by the horizon that mortality places at the edge of every long view. You cannot plan meaningfully beyond what you can reasonably expect to live to see, and so the plans that humans make are by necessity human-sized. They are not small for that. A human life fully lived and genuinely engaged contains more than enough complexity and meaning to fill the planning capacity available to it. But it is bounded in a particular way, and that boundary shapes everything. The urgency attached to goals, the willingness to begin things that will take decades to complete, the relationship between what you do now and what you expect to follow from it. Carlyle had stopped thinking in human increments sometime in his 2nd century of immortal life. He was not certain exactly when the shift had occurred. It was not a discrete moment, but a gradual reorientation, the slow recalibration of a mind that had outlived its original temporal framework and needed a new one. By the decades following breaking dawn, he thought in generations, not his own generations, which were a vampire's generations, the long arcs of a coven's development across centuries, but human generations, the 30-year rhythms of birth and growing and passing that he had watched cycle through the families and communities he moved among across 400 years of practice. He thought about what the world would look like in 50 years and in 100 years and beyond that. And he thought about these things not as abstractions, but as planning horizons, as actual time frames within which the decisions he made now would play out their consequences. This was the kind of thinking the Olympic Coven's far future required, and it was the kind of thinking that Carlyle, more than anyone else in the family, was equipped to do. The stability of the Coven across centuries was not a given. It was not guaranteed by the strength of the bonds that existed in any particular decade, because bonds required maintenance, the ongoing daily practice of attention and honesty, and the willingness to navigate difficult together rather than around each other. A family of immortals faced specific and unusual pressures on that maintenance that no human family philosophy had ever needed to account for fully. The sheer duration of proximity was one such pressure. Humans who find a relationship difficult can take comfort in the knowledge that circumstances will eventually change, that the difficult person will move away, or that time will bring natural distance, or that life will simply shift in ways that alter the configuration. Immortals faced none of these natural rescues. The people you were with indefinitely, and the things that were unresolved between you remained available to generate friction for as long as you both existed. The Cullens had navigated this more successfully than most immortal groups, and the reason was not difficult to identify. Carlyle's philosophy, his foundational conviction that immortal life was worth living with care and compassion, that the vegetarian commitment was not merely a practical arrangement, but an ethical one that said something important about what kind of beings they intended to be, gave the family a shared orientation that went deeper than personal compatibility. They were not merely people who happened to get along reasonably well. They were people committed to a common understanding of what their existence meant and how it should be conducted. That shared understanding was the load-bearing wall of everything the family had built, and its maintenance was not passive. It required each of them to genuinely hold the commitment, to renew it across the changing circumstances of each decade, to bring it into contact with new situations and new challenges, and continue to find it adequate to those situations. For the first century after breaking dawn, that maintenance held with the same fundamental consistency it had shown before. The crises came, as crises always did. External threats assessed and navigated, internal tensions acknowledged and worked through. The ongoing complex negotiation of shared immortal life continued with the honesty and the care that had always characterized it at its best. What changed across that first century was not the foundation, but the texture. The family became collectively something more settled than it had been in any previous period of its existence. Not complacent. Complacency in their world was a form of danger, and they all understood that, but genuinely at home in what they were, in a way that the perpetual motion of the preceding decades had not quite permitted. The Volturi question evolved across that same century in ways that were slower and more incremental than either side might have predicted in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation. Aro's patience was not infinite, but it was extraordinary, and the calculation that had prevented him from moving against the Cullens in the years immediately following breaking dawn remained largely valid for decades afterward. The Olympic Coven's alliance network did not weaken with time in the way that Aro had perhaps hoped it would. If anything, it deepened. The relationships built in the crisis of the confrontation were maintained across the subsequent years, with the same care that Carlyle brought to everything he valued, and maintained relationships compound interest in ways that crisis-assembled ones often do not. Covens that had come to the clearing as witnesses found themselves, across the following decades, in genuine correspondence with Carlyle, in occasional visits that became expected rather than remarkable, in the slow accumulation of a real network rather than a temporary coalition. Aro watched this. He was always watching, in the particular way that very old minds watch things they cannot immediately address, with attention distributed across decades rather than concentrated in any single moment, with the patience of someone who has seen enough history to know that circumstances always eventually shift, that what seems stable never stays exactly as it appears, that the long game rewards those willing to play it with genuine commitment to the length. He did not move against the Cullens in that first century. He did not formally acknowledge the confrontation or its outcome in any public way that the broader vampire world might record. He maintained the ambiguity that served him, and he waited. What he had not fully calculated was the way the Olympic Coven's example accumulated weight across time. The vegetarian philosophy was not something Carlyle had ever promoted aggressively. He was not by nature an evangelist, did not believe that the right way to bring about the world he hoped for was to argue people into it. What he believed in was demonstration, the slow, consistent evidence of a life lived differently, available for observation by anyone who came into contact with the family, communicating through example rather than advocacy. This was a slower method. It was also, he had found, considerably more durable. People who adopted a change because they had argued themselves into it could argue themselves back out of it when the argument became difficult. People who adopted a change because they had watched someone they respected live it and found it compelling were bound to it by something less reversible than logic. The Denali Coven had been vegetarian for nearly as long as the Cullens. Their commitment had been built on different foundations. Tanya and her sisters had arrived at the animal diet through their own history and their own reasoning. But the parallel existence of two established vegetarian covens in the Northern Hemisphere represented something that the broader vampire world could not entirely ignore. Other individuals encountered one or the other coven across the decades, and occasionally, not frequently, not in a torrent of conversion, but occasionally with the quiet consistency of a real pattern rather than an anomaly. An individual who had lived differently found that they wanted to try something else. Some succeeded, some did not. Some returned to their previous existence after a period of genuine attempt, having discovered that the commitment was harder in practice than it had appeared from outside. But the attempts were happening, and Carlyle noticed them and was careful to receive each one with the same patient, non-judgmental support, because he understood that the process required decades to evaluate properly, and that his role in it was not to judge outcomes, but to remain available as a resource. What would the vampire world look like in 200 years or 300? Carlyle did not know, and he was honest with himself and with his family about that uncertainty. The vegetarian philosophy spreading to a majority of vampires was not a realistic expectation within any planning horizon he could responsibly identify. The human appetite that became bloodlust in vampires was not a mild preference that a compelling argument could redirect. It was as fundamental to their nature as breathing had been in human life, and the discipline required to redirect it permanently was significant and ongoing and available only to those for whom the ethical reasons behind it were genuinely motivating, rather than abstractly acknowledged. Most vampires did not find those reasons sufficiently motivating. That was simply true. But some did, and some would, and the slow accumulation of some across centuries was not nothing. It was, in fact, the only way real change of that kind ever happened, not in a revolution, but in a gradual shift of what was considered possible, what was known to be achievable, what a vampire could be if they chose to be it. The human world, across those centuries, changed in ways that would have been genuinely difficult to anticipate, even from a planning horizon of several decades. Technology had been transforming human life at an accelerating pace since the Industrial Revolution, and that acceleration did not slow in the centuries following breaking dawn. The speed of change in the human world created particular challenges for the Cullens that were different in character from the challenges of any previous era. Not harder, necessarily, but requiring a different quality of adaptation. Earlier eras had changed slowly enough that a decade of careful attention was generally sufficient to stay current, to understand the new landscape well enough to move through it without attracting notice. The later centuries required more continuous monitoring, more rapid adjustment, more willingness to change surface practices before the previous adjustment had fully settled. Alice was the family's greatest asset in navigating this, for reasons that went beyond the obvious usefulness of her precognitive gift. She was genuinely interested in the future, not anxious about it, not merely monitoring it for threats, but curious about it in a way that made her attention to its development genuinely engaged, rather than merely functional. She followed the trajectories of human, technological and cultural development with the interest of someone who expected to be living in whatever future those trajectories produced and wanted to understand it on its own terms. This orientation made her adaptation to each new era faster and more complete than a purely reactive approach would have allowed. The question of whether the Coven would grow across the centuries was one that Carlyle returned to periodically, with the same careful ethical attention he had always brought to it. He had turned 4 people in the course of his immortal life: Edward, Esme, Rosalie, Emmett, and each transformation had been made under the specific conditions his ethics required. A person who would otherwise die, who had demonstrated through their human life a quality of character that suggested they could navigate immortal existence in accordance with his philosophy, whose consent could be inferred from the circumstances even when it could not be directly obtained. He had never turned anyone out of loneliness or desire for company, or the simple wish to have more people around him. The bar was specific, and he held it firmly. The conditions he required would arise again, across enough centuries. They were rare. Most dying people were dying people, and nothing more. And most of the rare individuals who might have had the temperament for the life Carlyle offered did not come to the edge of death in circumstances where his intervention was both possible and clearly indicated. But across centuries, rare things accumulated. He had turned 4 people across 4 centuries of practice. There was no reason to assume the next 4 centuries would produce 0 such encounters, given enough time and enough movement through the human world. The family would grow probably, slowly, carefully, with the same deliberate attention to each individual case that had characterized every previous edition. And each new person would bring what every new person always brought. Eyes, different history, a different gift perhaps, a different way of seeing, that would enrich the collective understanding of what the family was and what it could be. Edward and Bella, at a century of marriage, were something that neither of them had a prior model for being, because no prior model existed. A century of marriage was not something any human tradition had ever needed to address. The institutions and rituals and accumulated wisdom that humans had developed around marriage were all scaled to human lifetimes, to the 30 or 40 or 50 years that a fortunate human couple might have together before death ended the arrangement. What a marriage looked like at 100 years was a question that only immortals could answer from experience, and the answer that Edward and Bella were living was quieter and more ordinary seeming than the urgency of their early years might have suggested. They were each other's most familiar and most inexhaustible companion. This sounds like a small thing stated simply, but it was not small. Familiarity without boredom, genuine sustained interest in the same person across a century of daily proximity, required that both people be genuinely interesting in ways that deepened rather than depleted across time, and that the relationship between them remain a space of honest engagement rather than comfortable performance. Edward and Bella had both, and had maintained both, through the ongoing work of continuing to actually see each other rather than simply inhabiting a shared narrative about who they were to each other. It was not effortless. It was the effort that made it real. The cottage had expanded across the decades, rebuilt and extended several times by Esme's loving attention, always reflecting the specific people who lived in it at each stage of their long life together. The piano had been there from early on, and the walls of books that Bella had accumulated had expanded to occupy what had once been two separate rooms, and the garden had grown into something that required genuine tending and rewarded it with a particular kind of late afternoon beauty that Bella had decided, somewhere in the third decade of living with it, was among her favorite things about being alive in the physical world. These were ordinary domestic details. They were also the substance of a century of shared life, and the weight they carried was proportional to that. The forests of the Pacific Northwest remained, across all the decades, the landscape that felt most like home to the family. They had lived in many places, cities and countryside, different climates and different geographies, different languages and different light. All of it had been interesting. Some of it had been beautiful. None of it had resolved into home the way the mist and the old-growth trees and the river behind the Cullen house had resolved into home across the long accumulation of years. Home was not merely familiarity, though familiarity was part of it. It was the place where your history lived in the landscape itself, where you could walk through a forest and feel the weight of everything that had happened there, all the decades of living and returning, accumulated in the specific quality of light, falling through specific trees at a particular hour of a particular season. The Olympic Coven's future, examined honestly across the long view that centuries permitted, was not a future of resolved tensions and permanent safety. The Volturi would remain a complex and not entirely predictable presence in their world for as long as Aro remained Aro, which was likely to be a very long time indeed. The challenges of maintaining anonymity in a human world of increasing technological sophistication would continue to require adaptation and intelligence and the ongoing application of Alice's gift to the problem of staying current. The losses would come. The wolves who stopped phasing and aged and eventually died. The human connections that the family made and lost across the decades. The ordinary grief of living in a mortal world while being immortal, which was an ordinary grief only in the sense that it recurred regularly, not in the sense that it ever became easy. But the foundation held. That was the essential fact, the one that all the specific projections and considerations and careful long-viewed thinking returned to in the end. The foundation that Carlyle had built across 4 centuries of deliberate, patient, principled living. The conviction that immortal life could be lived with grace and compassion and genuine love for the world it moved through. Held across everything the centuries brought. The Olympic Coven would endure. Not because it was invulnerable, not because it had solved every problem or resolved every tension, but because it was made of people who had chosen, repeatedly, and with full understanding of what the choice cost, to remain, to be a family, to hold the foundation and live from it, century after patient century, in the long and quiet and extraordinary life that lay ahead. And so, we draw back slowly, the way the mist draws back from the tree line in the early morning. Not all at once, not abruptly, but gradually, the world revealing itself in gentle increments as the light comes in and the night releases its hold on things. The Cullen house is quiet now. The river runs behind it, the same river that has always run behind it, indifferent to decades and centuries in the way that rivers are indifferent to almost everything except the slow, patient work of finding their course. The old growth trees stand at the edges of the property, their roots going down into earth that has held them for hundreds of years, their canopy filtering the moonlight into something soft and diffuse and kind. Inside the house, everything is still. The grand piano in the main room catches what light there is and holds it. The shelves of books and the careful, beautiful objects that Esme has arranged across decades of loving attention to this space exist in the particular piece of rooms that are genuinely inhabited, that have absorbed the presence of people who love each other and carry that absorption quietly in the quality of their air. In the cottage through the trees, Edward and Bella are as they have always been, together. That is the simplest and most complete thing that can be said about them, and it has been true across every version of their life, across the urgency of their beginning and the crisis of their middle years, and the long, settled, extraordinarily ordinary peace of their centuries together. They chose each other again and again, across every decade that asked them to make the choice anew. They are still choosing. They will go on choosing, in the quiet and unhurried way of people who have all the time that exists and have decided, without reservation or remainder, how they want to spend it. This is what the Olympic Coven's future holds at its deepest and most essential level. Not the political standoff with Volterra, though that is real and will require continued navigation across the centuries ahead. Not the evolution of Bella's shield or the refinement of Alice's vision, or the long and patient work of Carlyle's alliances, though all of these things matter and will continue to unfold in ways that no outline could fully capture. What the future holds, at its core, is this: people who love each other, choosing to remain, century after century, in whatever form the world requires of them, choosing to stay and to be, and to hold the foundation that has always been the real source of everything they are. They have faced the oldest and most powerful vampires in the world, and they are still here. They have faced transformation and grief, and the specific terror of nearly losing each other, and they are still here. They have reinvented themselves across decades of changing human culture and shifting supernatural politics, and they are still here, still recognizably themselves, still the family that Carlyle built, from compassion and philosophy and the radical conviction that immortal life was worth living with care. That is not a small thing. In a world that is very old and very dark in places, that is not a small thing at all. You have traveled tonight through decades and centuries alongside them. You have sat with Carlyle in his quiet study as he wrote letters by firelight, building his network of alliances with the patience of someone who thinks in generations. You have stood with Bella in her early morning clearing, feeling the edges of a shield that breathed like something alive. You have watched Edward and Bella discover what love looks like when you remove the horizon of mortality from it, and find that it becomes something vaster and quieter and more extraordinary than urgency alone could ever have made it. You have walked beside the wolves across the bittersweet arc of their aging and sat with Rosalie in her honest grief and listened to Alice read a future that she has spent decades learning to understand with genuine nuance and care. You have seen what a family looks like when it holds together, not because it must, but because it has decided, collectively and individually, that it wants to. Let that settle in you now, gently, the way the mist settles over the forest at this hour. Let the Cullen house grow quiet in your mind. Let the river find its sound at the edges of your awareness, low and steady and unhurried, the sound that water makes when it has found its course and is simply following it, patient and entirely without resistance. The story does not end. That is the particular truth of an immortal story, the thing that makes it different from every human narrative that has ever been told. There is no final chapter, no last page, no moment when the house goes dark for the last time and the river runs on alone. The Cullens continue. Beyond every horizon this telling has reached, into centuries that belong to them and to the long unfolding future of the world they move through. But you have seen enough of it tonight to know what that future is made of. You have seen the foundation, and you know it holds. So let yourself rest now. Let the image of the house by the river exist at the very edge of your awareness, soft and lit and quiet, the way a light in a window looks from a distance on a dark road, not demanding your attention, just present, just warm, just there. Let the old growth trees stand at the edges of your dreaming, their roots deep in the familiar earth. Let the mist come in, the way it always does at this hour in this place, and let it soften everything it touches into something gentle and unhurried and easy to release. You have been in good company tonight, the company of people who chose love in a world that offered them every reason to choose otherwise, who chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier, who chose to remain when leaving would have cost them nothing. That is the kind of company that stays with you, even after the story is over, even when the words have quieted and the world has gone still, and there is nothing left but the sound of your own breathing, slow and even and easy, carrying you down into the deep and restful dark where dreams begin. The Olympic Coven endures, in the house by the river, in the clearing where a shield breathes like something alive, in the music that drifts from a cottage window on a quiet evening, in the letters Carlyle writes by firelight to the far corners of a world he has spent 4 centuries learning to love. They endure, patient and present and entirely irrevocably themselves. And you, sleepy heart, you rest. Let the river carry you. Let the trees stand over you in the dark, deep-rooted and still. Let the mist come in soft and cool and kind, and let it take the last of the waking world with it as it goes. The story is safe. The family holds. The house is quiet. Good night.